Welcome to the Plugged Into Reading overview video. This video will provide you with an in-depth view of Dr. Janet Allen's Plugged Into Reading. We are excited that you are taking the time to view our product and will happily provide you with additional information upon your request. Plugged Into Reading is more than just a reading program. It is a comprehensive literacy toolbox. Students read real books that engage them, and teachers teach strategies that the students need in order to become better readers and writers. We are certain that Plugged Into Reading will be a solution for your teachers in helping to improve student achievement. Let's take a look at the goals to see why. The most important goal for Plugged Into Reading is to get students interested and engaged in reading. Once students are engaged in reading, teachers teach or model literacy strategies for fiction and nonfiction. Ultimately, students are then able to transfer the strategies and skills they learn in Plugged Into Reading to their textbooks and in other classes, or with any other book that they read. Plugged Into Reading can be used in virtually any classroom. Many schools use Plugged Into Reading for their intervention students. However, many of those same schools have realized that Plugged Into Reading is also great for their core reading classes and even their accelerated students. Plugged Into Reading is currently being used in all of the different classrooms listed on the slide. This figure illustrates a piece of research that supports the teaching model used with Plugged Into Reading. This is a visual of how much information students retain in their classrooms with different modalities of teaching. We see here that students only retain about 5% of what they get through lecture, which means in order to be an effective teacher, one must incorporate those strategies that are on the lower half of the pyramid, in which the numbers begin to get much larger. Those are the same teaching strategies that are used in the teaching model for Plugged Into Reading that we will see on the next slide. The gradual release responsibility is used as the teaching model for Plugged Into Reading. You will see here there are 3 phases of Plugged Into Reading. First is direct instruction, where the teacher demonstrates or models strategies for reading, writing, speaking, and listening. This is done in a whole class setting. Next, students transition into small guided practice groups where teachers begin to transfer some of the responsibility to the learning of the group. Here, students read together and work collaboratively on the same strategies they learned during their whole class instruction. Eventually, students are able to apply those same strategies they have learned during whole class instruction and small group practice to a text they read independently for independent practice and application. As you can see, Plugged Into Reading is a literacy toolbox with everything a teacher needs to successfully teach fiction and nonfiction literacy standards. The teacher's guide has all the lessons already planned out for every phase of Plugged Into Reading, and the resource disc has all the student materials that support all of the lessons. Books and audiobooks, as well as professional development books, are also included in the Plugged Into Reading program. Audio support is available for all core books, all small group books, and most of the independent reading books. These audiobooks are professionally unabridged recordings of the book. The gradual release responsibility is also encouraged with this component of Plugged Into Reading. For students that struggle with reading, the audio serves as a scaffold, allowing the students to hear a fluent modeled read of the book. Students are always reminded to follow along with the book while they listen. While it is our goal for all students to be able to read and comprehend on their own, not all students are able to do so. The audiobook gives those students access to the same books as their peers, allowing them to read books that they want to read, not just books that they can read. Here we see examples of one type of assessment available with Plugged Into Reading. These are examples of formative assessment because they help teachers to form their instruction the next day. These can also be used as summative assessment at the end of each section of the book. Here we see a different example of a summative assessment for Plugged Into Reading. Each book has an end of the book test that is a mixture of multiple choice and open-ended questions. These questions focus on comprehension and the strategies that the students learned while reading the book. The last type of assessment for Plugged Into Reading is the pre-post assessment. These can be used to help teachers find the areas of instruction that their students are most in need of. Before we begin looking deeper into each phase of Plugged Into Reading, let's first take a look at the big picture of Plugged Into Reading. Students begin reading books they choose for independent reading at the very beginning of the year and continue into the end of the year. When students are engaged in independent reading, the teacher will conduct a shared reading of the core text and teach needed strategies through direct instruction. During this direct instruction phase, students are still continuing to have time for independent reading in a book of their choice. Upon completion of the core text, students are transitioned into small groups. In these small groups, students begin to take on more responsibility of their learning with guided reading of a new text. During this peer-supported learning phase, students still continue to read books of their choice during independent reading time. Upon completion of the peer-supported groups, teachers may choose to either transition back to direct instruction to teach more needed strategies whole class, or they may choose to have students begin to read a new book in a small group for additional peer-supported learning. For the remainder of the school year, teachers continue to transition back and forth from direct instruction to peer-supported learning. The whole time, students continue to be engaged in independent reading with a book of their choice. As we see on the screen in orange, the third and final phase of plugged-in reading, self-directed learning, comes at some point later in the school year. This is a time when students begin to take on even more responsibility of their learning by applying the strategies they have learned during independent reading time. In summary, students in a plugged-into reading classroom will always be reading two books. One will be a book that they chose for independent reading, and the other will either be a book that the whole class is reading together or a book that they are reading with their small group. Now let's look a little deeper into each phase of plugged into reading. We will first look at independent reading, which is a time when students are able to choose a book they want to read and to begin clocking the essential reading mileage necessary to maintain or increase their reading level. In a plugged into reading classroom, students are able to choose any book they want to read, not just the books in the plugged into reading collection. However, for reluctant readers, there are highly engaging books that offer a wide range of topics and reading levels. For struggling students, most of the books in the Plugged Into Reading collection have audio support to help those students access books of interest, not just the books in their reading level. As you can see, the independent library with audio support gives teachers and students more tools in their toolbox. The goal for independent reading is to give students a chance to clock essential reading mileage while reading a book of their choice. While it is tempting to have students read a book a couple days a week, it is critical that we encourage teachers to consider this as a non-negotiable every day. We build habits by doing important tasks daily, not just a couple days a week. In addition, we need to remind teachers that the goal for independent reading is for students to read a book of their choice for enjoyment. Let's face it, in school, students have been conditioned to equate reading with work. All day long, they are assigned reading with an accompanying task that they must complete for a grade. So, how important is independent reading anyway? Janet Allen cites that independent reading is the single most important thing kids can do to become better readers. Like everything else in life, we get better by practicing. Janet also cites in her research that students have to read at least 45 minutes a day to maintain their current reading level. We often wonder how students that were on grade level at a younger age can become 2 years below grade level within just 2 years' time. Simply, the students did not read for those 2 years, and they were unable to maintain that reading level. As we see on the screen, students have to read 90 minutes a day to increase their reading level over a year's time. Finally, we know through research that there is a direct correlation between the amount of time spent reading and student achievement. In the table, we see that students who achieve in the 90th percentile across the United States read an average of 40 minutes a day. Those performing in the 10th percentile read an average of only about a minute and a half a day. If teachers want their students to achieve well in school, they must be certain that they are reading every day. Once teachers have successfully engaged their students with independent reading, they can begin the instructional process with the first phase of plugged into reading, teacher-directed instruction. This is the time when teachers use the gradual release of responsibility to teach much-needed strategies so students can develop the necessary skills they need to become better readers and writers. Here we see the skill focus for plugged into reading nonfiction listed on the screen. Keep in mind that these are the overarching skills that break down into several much-needed nonfiction skills. Basically, if students are able to acquire these 8 big skills, they will be able to successfully read or write any nonfiction in or out of the classroom. During the teacher-directed instruction phase of Plugged Into Reading, the teachers and students read the designated whole class book together while focusing on those 8 power strategies. The teacher begins with a shared reading of the text so that every student hears a fluent read of the book. The teacher does not teach the book. He or she uses the book to hook and engage the students. Once engaged, the teacher chooses the needed strategies and models them for the students, always linking them back to the book to make the connections necessary for the learning to take place. Once the teacher has modeled the selected strategy for the whole class, students are asked to work with their partner or small group to practice that strategy that was just taught. Once students have had the opportunity to work collaboratively on the strategy, they are then asked to show what they have learned by practicing the strategy independently. This gradual release of responsibility is used every day in a plugged-into reading classroom. As we begin to look into the teacher's guide, we see that all the teacher support is included within these pages. This page shows us key information about the book that will be read for whole class instruction, a book talk, a summary, text features that will be highlighted within this book, background knowledge for the teachers, talking points, as well as other helpful information. This Skills and Strategies matrix shows us all the skills and strategies that can be taught while reading this book, as well as the section of the book in which they will find these lessons. This is a great tool for planning or mapping out the focus of the strategy instruction for this book. There are also Common Core alignments for plugged into reading. These are currently not included in the teacher's guide, but can be given to teachers on an as-needed basis. There are several other pages in the teacher's guide that will assist in preparing the teacher for strategy instruction with the core novel or core text. It is important to note that the teacher will only spend about 4 to 5 weeks on the core novel or core text, because that is about how long we can engage students with a good book. Any more than that, the kids will get bored and will no longer be engaged. Once the engagement is gone, the effectiveness of our strategy lessons is also gone. As illustrated here, there are far more lessons available than will be used. Teachers will pick and choose the lessons that fit the needs of their students. They will pick only a few lessons from each section of the book. As we see here, teachers no longer have to spend hours planning the lessons. They simply pick the lesson and then implement it as Jana outlines, or how they see it will work best with their students. All of the student materials that support those lessons are included on a resource disc. Each lesson has a graphic organizer that helps give the visual representation of the thinking process for that strategy being taught. Also included are short pieces of nonfiction text that can be used to make connections to the core novel or core text. Janet plans these as read-alouds for each section of the book so teachers can assist their students in making text-to-text connections. These short pieces of text can also help teachers meet the Common Core requirements for short nonfiction texts. As a reminder, teacher-directed instruction is the first phase of plugged-into reading in which teachers pick and choose strategy lessons that fit the needs of their students while reading an engaging book. The second phase of plugged-into reading is peer-supported learning. Teachers begin to gradually release some of the responsibility of learning to their students by having them read a new novel or text and practice the strategies they have taught them collaboratively. For nonfiction, these small groups are called power strategy groups, and for fiction, these small groups are called literature circles. For nonfiction, students are part of a power strategy group, where they read a new nonfiction text, now focusing only on 2 of the power strategies instead of all 8. To begin the group, the teacher conducts a teacher-led lesson that once again models those 2 power strategies for the group. Students follow along and practice in their power strategy guides. As we can see in this illustration, some students will be reading independently while others will be beginning their teacher-led lesson with the small group. The teacher-led lesson is completely written out for the teacher to either follow along as a script or use as a guide. Either way, the teacher is reteaching 2 of the power strategies that were taught earlier during whole class instruction. The students use a type of lesson plan called Now You're in Charge to guide them through the practice lessons as they continue reading the book and practicing in their power strategy guides. Teachers have many support tools to help them implement and assess the power strategy groups, including checklists, and rubrics as seen on the screen. For fiction, the peer-supported small groups are called literature circles. Students read books